Is Suspiria a Giallo? No. In all seriousness, on its surface, a video arguing a film's genre status is shallow and reductive, and I'm not here to gatekeep. Dario Argento Suspiria is my all-time favorite horror film, and seeing someone refer to it as a Giallo versus a supernatural horror film has never diminished its quality in my eyes. In fact, I can't think of any situation where a film's genre has affected my ability to properly enjoy it or analyze it. So, why make the argument? Well, the term Giallo, as it relates to genre, has a very broad definition, and from its birth in the early 1960s to the present day, the genre has evolved significantly. It is a river with many streamlets and tributaries. Upon close examination, there are so many variations within the genre that it completely eschews anything that resembles a basic definition. However, even with all these variations, to identify Suspiria as a Giallo is to oversimplify both the film and the Giallo genre itself. Because as diverse as the DNA of the genre is in its makeup, it is still very identifiable. Laid out like a timeline, key producers, writers, directors, and actors pop up here and there, as do their respective films. I would argue that Suspiria is not one of these films. Make no mistake though, it is certainly an influential film, but it did not have any sort of impact on the Italian Giallo genre zeitgeist of the 1970s. For some context, in 1977, the Italian film industry was still in a period where cycles, trends, and traditions ruled the scene. In the 1950s, it was sword and sandal or peplum films in the style of Ben-Hur and Spartacus. In the 1960s, it was the Western that took top earnings at the box office, with classics like Sergio Leone's The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, and Sergio Corbucci's Django. These films, of course, have their own identities, but owe at least some of their success to the films of Akira Kurosawa and John Ford. In the 1970s, Eurocrime or poliziotteschi films dominated theaters with films like Elio Petri's Investigation of a Citizen Above Suspicion and Enzo G. Castellari's Street Law. These films were the urban translation of the Western and drew inspiration from films like Dirty Harry, Death Wish, and Costa Garva's Zed. In addition, they also commented on the ongoing Years of Lead, a dark period of Italy's history, plagued by a plethora of criminal and political violence. Unsurprisingly, this only scratches the surface of what Italian popular cinema looked like throughout the mid-20th century. However, it still helpfully illustrates that most Italian filmmakers made their livings by building off of each other, as well as what was the latest and greatest from other nations, especially the United States. In the same tradition, the earliest Gialli drew a lot of inspiration from Henri-Georges Clouzot's Les Diaboliques, as well as Michael Powell's Peeping Tom and Alfred Hitchcock's Psycho. Simultaneously, their popularity took root because of the popularity of murder mystery novels written by Agatha Christie and Edgar Wallace. The Italian versions of these novels were extremely popular and often printed with yellow covers, hence the name Giallo. But wait, this was supposed to be about Suspiria, wasn't it? Well, part of what makes Suspiria so significant is that it doesn't fit into any of these conventions, cycles, or traditions. It can't be regularly labeled, and significantly, nobody tried to copy it in the years following its release. In fact, Argento's own sequel, Inferno, is the only film from the era that even comes close to anything that could be considered similar, and even that film takes steps to set itself apart from its predecessor. So, placing the film in a category where it doesn't belong serves not only to discredit the film in question, but also shift the conversation away from the many films that do fit the definition, many of which have gone underrated, underseen, and generally overlooked in the years since their release. So, even if I don't manage to convince you that Suspiria isn't a Giallo, that's okay, because it isn't my primary aim. My primary aim is to answer the questions aroused by the statement, Suspiria isn't a Giallo. Because in order to fully grasp what that means, we have to examine what a, quote, real Giallo is, what sets them apart from Suspiria, and what Suspiria does to set itself apart. In turn, this video will serve as an examination of the genre throughout its history, a dissection of its many identifiers, a reappraisal of the many forgotten films within it, and an examination of Suspiria's place within it all. The Giallo genre is often defined by a set of very specific tropes. Black gloves, open razors, a whodunit mystery. Witnesses to crimes forget key pieces of information, only to remember them at the 11th hour, and the final reveal is, when done well, climactic and surprising. These particular elements were pioneered by Mario Bava in his ahead-of-its-time classic Blood and Black Lace from 1964, before being popularized by Dario Argento's landmark Giallo, The Bird with the Crystal Plumage, in 1970. Between Argento's classic and sometime around the mid-1970s, this particular brand of Giallo was king. This period brought us Sergio Martino's The Strange Vice of Mrs. Ward, The Case of the Scorpion's Tail, Your Vice is a Locked Room and Only I Have the Key, and Torso. Gore maestro Lucio Fulci also contributed the triumphant Don't Torture a Duckling during this era. Genre chameleon Umberto Lenzi, whose work we'll touch on more in depth later, also gave us his wonderfully surreal Spasmo, as well as the more by-the-numbers 7 blood-stained Orchids. Argento would also follow up Bird with the competent The Cat o' Nine Tails and the ethereal Four Flies on Grey Velvet. That might look like a lot of films, however, these are only a few of the most popular and well-known gialli to come out of Italy during this period. And because of their status and the many traits they share, they've sort of taken over the definition of what it means to be a giallo. However, the definition is much broader, especially to Italian audiences. In Italy, the word filone is often used when discussing film genres. It has many meanings: vein, current, stream, and it is used to express the sentiment that something is in the tradition of something else. When combined with Filone's translation to stream, the concept really begins to solidify. Imagine the entire horror genre as one large river. As we travel down it, we notice that the main current branches off into various streams and rivulets. These small branches are the vampire film, the haunted house film, and the zombie film, to name only a few. They are distinctly horror, but they are different enough from each other to create their own subcategory. We can think of the giallo in much the same way. The fiumi gialli branches off into the well-known black-gloved killer mysteries of the classic era. These films are also prone to branch off into different categories of their own, such as the male-led M giallo, where a male protagonist gets involved in a murder and must solve it before he is killed himself. Conversely, the F giallo of this era focuses on women who must navigate a dense cast of men who constantly blur the line between lover, suitor, and murderer, although you'll find yourself hard-pressed locating a decent man in any one of these films. It was also fashionable to portray these women as mentally unstable and sadomasochistic. Further down the river, there are also conspiratorial gialli, where an individual must unravel mysteries regarding secret societies and cults. These are best exemplified by films like Aldo Short Night of Glass Dolls from 1971 and Francesco Barilli's The Perfume of the Lady in Black from 1974. Another stream is home to the giallo polizioteschi hybrid films, best exemplified by Massimo Dallamano's What Have They Done to Your Daughters from 1974, and Sergio Martino's The Suspicious Death of a Minor from 1975. Even Mondo films, which were Italian documentaries from the 1960s, focusing on cultural taboos in developing countries, dipped their toes into the giallo gene pool with 1972's Haitian set, Tropic of Cancer, and that's just the gialli of the 1970s. Prior to Argento's 1970 debut, the films that Italian audiences considered gialli looked much different. Talk to most Italian horror aficionados, and they'll tell you that the giallo was invented by Mario Bava when he released The Girl Who Knew Too Much in 1963 and Blood and Black Lace in 1964. While this is true, it is not the whole story. Unfortunately for Bava, he was ahead of his time. Girl received a lukewarm critical reception, and Black Lace was panned by contemporary critics, in addition to failing miserably at the box office. The more mainstream gialli of this era took their influences primarily from Henri-Georges Clouzot's 1955 classic Les Diaboliques. The classic of French cinema focuses on a woman who conspires with her abusive husband's mistress to murder him. The film was a big hit in Italy, and it wasn't long before filmmakers began making thrillers in the tradition of Les Diaboliques. The film's themes of adultery, revenge, conspiracy, and blackmail took center stage in films like Lucio Fulci's One on Top of the Other, Romolo Guerrieri's The Sweet Body of Deborah, and Umberto Lenzi's So Sweet, So Perverse. However, like much of popular Italian cinema, these films are much more than cheap, opportunistic imitations. So Sweet, So Perverse, for example, features a man who is disillusioned with his wife and begins an affair with his new neighbor. With his new mistress, he feels happy again, but her former abusive lover, prone to violence, is constantly lurking in the background. To say more would spoil a genuinely intriguing and complex narrative, complete with nuanced performances. Moreover, Lenzi and screenwriter Ernesto Gastaldi set the film against the jet-set lifestyle of late 60s Paris, giving the film's aesthetic a unique flair while also commenting on the many sins rich, beautiful people visit upon one another. However, while there is violence to a certain degree, there is nothing that resembles the throat slashings of Argento and latter-day Fulci. Still, that doesn't make this film or others in his oeuvre any less giallo. And although these films are deep cuts and don't have quite the polish of their 70s cousins, they're much more than cinematic artifacts, foundational pieces that pave the way for better things. I would encourage anyone interested in Giallo to promptly seek out the films mentioned, in addition to Umberto Lenzi's Orgasmo, Luigi Bazzoni and Franco Rossellini's The Possessed, Giulio Questi's Death Laid an Egg, and Ernesto Gastaldi's Libido. Just tailor your expectations accordingly. So, we've determined that the definition of a giallo is pretty broad, and that kind of sounds like it would hurt my argument that Suspiria is not a giallo. Not quite though, because as much as the genre is defined by its tropes, it is equally defined by its place within the cultural zeitgeist of popular Italian cinema, which we've now traced from the early 60s to the mid-70s. In that period, we've seen the inciting release of The Girl Who Knew Too Much, the popularity of films in the tradition of Les Diaboliques, and the emergence of Argento, whose debut inspired a new cinematic movement all on its own. However, as important as Argento's contributions are to the genre, after his quote, Animal trilogy, he made it a point to gradually distance himself from the movement he helped start. His first step in this direction was Deep Red from 1975. Deep Red, or Profondo Rosso, is often referred to as a perfect giallo. Of course, such a description is subjective. However, it is undeniable that Argento's technical presentation of the tropes he began perfecting in his debut are honed razor sharp here. Every element from the cinematography and the script to the gore effects and the music are elevated to new heights. So, no matter what your personal opinion is of Deep Red, it is without a doubt the gold standard for the 70s era giallo. What's more, there aren't really any Deep Red clones out there. It's like all other giallo writers and directors collectively threw up their hands and said, "C'è succesi," and moved on. Moreover, Italian popular cinema was also in the process of phasing out the giallo and replacing it with the poliziotteschi. So, after making his so-called perfect giallo, what was there left for Argento to do but leave the genre he helped pioneer? Dario Argento's Suspiria is not a giallo, but it does share some aesthetics with the genre. His follow-up to Deep Red contains several plot and visual tropes featured heavily in the director's filmography. Susie, the protagonist, bears witness to a central event that she struggles to remember throughout the film. Murders are carried out by the hands of an off-screen killer, and although it is very much below the surface, there is a plotline focused on solving the mystery surrounding the film's many deaths and disappearances. However, these elements have far more in common with Argento's visual and storytelling proclivities than with the giallo genre itself. Furthermore, the film's mystery is only ever tangential. Suspiria is often, and rightfully so, judged based on the atmospheric notes it plays, created by its strikingly colorful visuals, its blaring dreamlike score by Goblin, and its viciously creative violence. And while I deem it harsh to call the film's plot an afterthought, I would agree that it isn't the primary concern. Even the film itself agrees. In the moments after the film's opening murder, Susie speaks with the school's directors about seeing the girl who was killed. The directors themselves are speaking with a group of detectives. In a giallo, these detectives would become recurring characters. Susie would also focus her efforts on finding a trail of clues that would lead her to the killer. And of course, the film would end with the climactic reveal that it was, insert character here, committing the murders all along. But Argento openly rejects all of these tropes. The detectives are never seen again, and Susie spends much more of her time learning about witchcraft instead of following a trail to a killer. And what's more, there's never really any mystery about who the killer is, nor is there any one killer. The film itself openly states that these elements are unimportant, a genuinely bold maneuver for the time. Combined with its surreal tone and nightmarish atmosphere, the film really is something that defies classification altogether. However, if necessary, it can only ever be filed under supernatural horror. But, you say, if the giallo genre is a river with many tributaries, wouldn't Suspiria fit just as well in one of its own? A supernatural giallo, if you will? My issue with this line of thinking is that, if you made this classification, Suspiria would be all by itself. The idea of in the tradition of in relation to the Filone would also require that Suspiria holds some similarity to a popular trend that came before it. Suspiria came at a culturally cluttered time in Italian cinema. Poliziotteschi and gialli ruled the market. Even some westerns were still being made. Lots were often in the cash-in, copycat style addressed earlier on. Suspiria is not only significant within this zeitgeist because of its formal distinctions, but because it didn't copy from anyone else, and nobody tried to copy it in return. It's actually quite remarkable that, in an industry that thrived on trends, there were no follow-ups in the tradition of Suspiria, which was very financially successful in both Italy and the United States. Again, the closest thing to resemble such a film is Dario Argento's own sequel, Inferno, from 1980, in which he strays even further from well-established tropes. So, Suspiria may not be a Giallo, but that, to me at least, only enhances its significance. It is a special film that openly refused to cash in or adhere to what was popular at the time, and although Argento gets a lot of credit for the final product, it wouldn't be anywhere near the film we know today without the major contributions Dario Nicolodi made to the script, the cinematography of Luciano Tovoli, and the score by Goblin, making it a shining testament to the collaborative nature of filmmaking. There was nothing like it prior to its release, and there really hasn't been anything like it since. It is in its own river, all by itself. It needs no classification at all. It is simply and only Suspiria. No conversation about popular Italian cinema is complete without mention of the Giallo. It is an essential piece of the nation's cinematic and cultural history, one that reflected the fears of the time, the political climate, cultural shifts, and so much more. It is a genre that has evolved significantly since its inception, from the diabolique and Agatha Christie-influenced thrillers of the 1960s to the black glove killer mysteries of the 70s and 80s. To the modern neo-giallo, the genre has a rich history worthy of in-depth examination. So, in the end, it really doesn't matter whether you think Suspiria is a giallo or not, and one shouldn't be considered any more or less a fan just because they think a film does or doesn't belong within a certain genre, because I think it's the inevitable follow-up question to the statement, Suspiria is not a giallo, that matters most. And that is, well, what is a giallo? Of course, as we've seen, the answer to that question is varied, complex, and full of history. So, if you find yourself curious, I highly recommend exploring each creek, stream, and tributary along I fiumi giallo, as I think you'll discover much more than good films.